I'm David McHale, Communication Specialist for the United Nations Capital Development Fund, or UNCDF. And let me say welcome to the first episode of a limited series that we are producing with our colleagues at UNTV. This limited series will focus on the topic of municipal and local finance, the challenges that municipalities in least developed countries face when it comes to accessing international capital, and why it is so important to change this ecosystem in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular, the promise of the Sustainable Development Goals to leave no one behind. Over the next several weeks, UNCDF will be interviewing thought leaders in this space to hear their thoughts on a variety of topics. Why do we need a better global financial ecosystem for municipal finance? What is the importance of international capital markets to LDCs when it comes to achieving sustainable development goals? What is the link between international municipal finance and the achievement of those goals, really to ensure that we leave no one behind? And then finally, how can we incentivize institutional investors to consider subnational investments in LDCs? Also, what historical examples exist of municipalities achieving development and growth through access to international capital, and how can those examples inform our work today? The goal of this limited series is to provide a level of understanding about this approach as we come to the second annual meeting of the Malaga Coalition for Municipal Investment Finance, which is led by UNCDF, United Cities and Local Governments, and the Global Fund for Cities Development. Today we are fortunate to have Jaffer Machano as our very first guest in this limited series. Jaffer is the Global Program Manager of UNCDF's Municipal Investment Finance Program, which is our program to support local governments in addressing key urbanization challenges through access to capital financing. Jaffer, so glad to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Great, thank you. And I think let's just get right into it, because this is a critical challenge. Number one, I think there is a knowledge issue in terms of just the mere existence of the challenges that municipalities face in terms of accessing international capital, and then kind of the history of those challenges. But let's just start off with just a sort of a baseline question. What are the practical challenges that municipalities, specifically in developing nations and in the LDCs, what are the challenges they face when it comes time for them to want to borrow in international capital markets?
Thank you, David. So I think the best way to look at it is majority of the fast-growing cities are actually in the developing countries. Sure. And therefore, the challenge of both urbanization and ability to manage risks that are brought by climate, and also providing jobs and all the issues that we hear about, they're actually over 50% of that is in developing countries. Mm-hmm. And then there's the issue of generational gap. What we know right now, a continent like Africa is actually getting younger in terms of population. So not only the population is growing, but by getting younger, that means there's more need and pressure to the authorities, mm-hmm. because these people are going to get married, they're going to have more kids, and there's need of cars and energy and all of that. So the challenge is immense. I think the challenge has been defined in a lot of other forums. But what is coming out more and more is there's maybe 3 or 4 major items to mm-hmm. look at from the perspective of capital. And the first one is majority of these countries actually have savings deficit. They do not have enough savings pool within the countries in order to support the needs of the investment needed in infrastructure and other areas, education and healthcare. And hence, there's always a need to bring in capital from outside of that country. And this is why the interest of how do we get access to international capital to go to the LDCs especially, but mostly developing countries. Right. So that's to sort of lay the ground and look at it that way. Traditionally, it has been ODA, Overseas Development Funds, has been FDI, Foreign Direct Investment, based on different countries' comparative advantages. But more and more is to try and discuss the issue that why not just have access to capital market based on the infrastructure needs or any other needs like a developed country infrastructure funding.
So just to break that out so that people understand, just explain at a very simple level the difference between a city in the United States and when it comes time for that city in terms of acquiring capital for infrastructure versus, so let's say a Los Angeles versus a Nairobi. What are the differences in their experiences in terms of how they approach capital markets if they want to fund infrastructure or something like that?
So a difference between Los Angeles and Nairobi. So an American city is actually very unique.
Sure.
Because the right to capital is actually enshrined in different sort of founding documents. So LA today can raise capital in the capital market like the United States raise capital in the capital market, or a company like Amazon or Facebook will raise capital with no problem of access. It will raise based on its capacity and its financial capabilities to repay that capital. So a city like Nairobi, to get access to capital, it will come within the limit of Kenya, a limit of IMF. So that limit is already sort of putting a ceiling on how much can Nairobi raise, regardless of what's the need of capital in Nairobi. A really good example right now, Nairobi is trying to issue a water bond, and it has been trying to do that for the last 3 years. So that's the major one. The second one, of course, is regulatory and policy environment within the country. Sure. The countries need to understand and open that space for the cities to be able to access capital market. And I'll say the third one is the capacity within the cities. So today, if you walk in any big North American city, whether it's Toronto or Miami, the capacity of individuals running that city is at the level that it can interact at ease with the financial markets. It can plan its budgets and projects and define. And even if it doesn't have that capacity, it can get that capacity easily from the market because it exists. This is what we call ecosystem. It's not available in a developing country.
Sure.
And this is where institutions like ours and institutions that can support capital to flow into these developing cities where assistance is needed. So,
and it's interesting, if I could go back to one of your points, while Los Angeles is not subject to a national borrowing limit, or for that matter, the national debt profile of the United States, Nairobi is subject to the national debt limit of Kenya. So that's a fundamental distinction.
Yes.
So if we could sort of focus on that point, and let's just take a step back, what are the historical drivers that led to this differentiation in the ability of a city in a developing country to access international capital versus a city in a developed country?
So actually, that's a very interesting topic, and maybe it needs a time of its own. But on the brief side, if you look of how the international financial architecture is designed, post-World War II, when the powers of the time set to create a new system because there was a need of a new system.
What we would call the Bretton Woods order.
What we call the Bretton Woods. They set to design 2 or 3 things maximum. First was the exchange rate mechanism. Right? And this is where there was a need of having a mechanism that exchange rates can convert from one exchange rate to another. And in order to maintain this and how the economic within the country units to be able to, the economies to trade to each other, this is where they created an IMF and gave it ability to be lend of last resort in order to support the mechanism of financial exchanges. Every country exchange was linked to the United States dollar, and then the dollar was linked to the gold standard. I mean, that went on until 1970s, I think 73. Therefore, the units that came to an agreement was sovereign states. So if a country did not have an internal structure of regulatory and policy environment that allowed cities and local governments to get access to capital, they automatically fell under the limit of a sovereign state. This went on to a lot of these countries had gone into debt problem, and then there was HIPIC initiatives and Paris Club initiative. So during these different debt sustainability program, this space got even tighter because then countries had to agree with IMF on instruments of policy on how debt limits will be used and will be raised from year to year. Now, if a Ministry of Finance is the one which is managing the overall limit debt for a country, the Minister of Finance is looking at the military, is looking at the education, is looking at hospitals, is looking at embassies in a foreign country. For a local community which needs water and to raise a bond, it comes and compete with all these other priorities within the national Ministry of Finance. And actually it says in a lot of these country amendments that the one who has the ability to borrow is the Ministry of Finance.
Right.
And it cannot be done the other way around. So this is a system, I will say one pillar of that system that needs to be looked at, to be broadened up a little bit, because post Millennium Development Goals and into SDGs, now we have this understanding that in order to not leave people behind, we need to provide service delivery to the community, whether it's water, whether it's electricity and energy, or local community for jobs. Majority of this is managed under a municipality or local government policy arrangement. So now we need the unit of development to start being including the local government, and therefore to allow local governments both policy initiative and decentralization, which we saw a lot of it within 80s, 90s, and we having a lot of local government elections and all of that. But now I think this last frontier is on capital and how that can be matched.
So first off, I think this has been a fantastic inaugural episode of this limited series. I'd like to close this episode with a final question. And it's really just, in terms of the existing ecosystem, let's envision if the ecosystem doesn't change between now and 2030. Talk about the SDG implications as it relates to developing nations generally and LDCs in particular. What are the stakes if we don't change the ecosystem?
I think in the nutrition world, there's a word called stunted growth.
Stunted growth.
I think we can apply slightly here because we now have an idea. We know that a lot of these challenges are actually local government challenges, whether the need is to have 100% primary education, majority of that is in the local governments, whether we need roads to be open so that local economy can pick up and jobs be created. This is local government, whether water needs, which is SDG 6, needs to be 100%. This is local government. So we now know this is needed. We know majority of it has been decentralized. There is, to some extent, fiscal space from the local governments, and the mayors are elected and the councillors, but we won't be able to implement the SDG to the fullest if we don't get capital at the right places.
Right. It's an excellent place to start. We'll be the first of what I'm sure will be many conversations. Jaffer, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.